So we're going to pass this around, and just whoever, just sign your name, and so we can keep track of who's been coming. And then before we dive into our list that we've got here, any questions that you guys have, like directly, I guess better way to put it, do you guys have any topics that you're really, really struggling with that you want us to put a lot of emphasis on?
So everybody's going to get 100?
Chapter 4 and Chapter 20. Chapter 4 and Chapter 20, sweet. Okay, well, how about we just start with producer and consumer surplus, because I feel like that's a pretty repetitive theme. So we'll start with that, and then we'll go from there, okay? You. Okay, so who can explain to me more or less what producer and consumer surplus is? Any volunteers? Help me out, make me feel a little less awkward. Please.
Consumer surplus is like that much more money that they make above equilibrium, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely one way to think of it. So there's a couple different ways to think of producer and consumer surplus, right? So you guys remember the concept of marginal cost and marginal benefit? You guys remember that more or less? So it's kind of like when I say, all right, the maximum benefit, so we're talking about consumers, right? Say, all right, the maximum benefit that I would get out of buying a new iPhone is $700, right? So if the cost is equal to that or less than that, then I'll buy that iPhone, right? Because that means that I'm getting more out of it than the money I'm giving out for it. Does that make sense? So then whatever gap there is between the cost and the benefit, that would be my consumer surplus. So anyway, this way. So benefit. If my maximum benefit to pay for an iPhone was $700, and I was able to find one, this would be marginal cost. And if I was able to find one for $600, what would be my consumer surplus of this transaction? $100, right? Because I was willing to pay $700, but I got it for $600. So I've got this surplus $100 that I didn't have to pay to get that iPhone. Does that make sense? And then the same thing is true for producers, right? They have a minimum price for which they're willing to produce and sell that unit. Does that make sense? So if I'm a producer, let's say I'm Apple, and the minimum price I'd be willing to accept for an iPhone, or let's not say an Apple, let's say I'm this guy on KSL, right? And let's say the minimum price I was willing to accept when I'm selling my phone on KSL or eBay was $500. So I'm the seller. And then I sell it for $600. What would be my producer surplus? $100, right? Then in turn, what would be the total surplus in this transaction? How do you get total surplus? Right, you just add them together. You add the consumer surplus, which is 100, right, and the producer surplus, which in this case was also 100, and your total surplus would be 200. Does that make sense? Is that giving anybody any heartburn? Is that pretty clear? Okay. It's actually an equation I'll probably throw up here. I have to remember.
Yeah.
You guys had it? What was that the last one?
All right. So then when we're looking at a graph, how do we find our consumer and producer surplus? Anybody tell me?
Consumer and producer surplus from
Right.
the graph.
Right.
So basically from guess the equilibrium point above on the left side, like top left, that triangle is the consumer surplus and the bottom half is producer surplus.
Yeah, that's right. Can you explain to me why that is?
Because
Because it is. Hey, that's okay. That's why we're here, right? So, when we're looking at this point right here, right, the equilibrium point, that is the point where marginal cost is equal marginal benefit, right? That would mean that because this represents, the consumers, their willingness to produce, and this represents, the producers and their willingness to produce, and this is consumers and their willingness to pay, right? So when in the market, marginal cost equals marginal benefit at this line. So at every other point along the demand curve, up until you reach this point, they have a consumer surplus, right? Because they're paying less than their value. And at every point before this point on the supply curve, they have a producer surplus because they're selling it for more than their minimum, right? Does that make sense?
Will you say that again?
Sure. So up until this point, right, that's where the price that sellers are receiving and the consumers are paying is exactly equal to the benefit they're getting out of the transaction. So at every point along this line that's before the equilibrium point, the consumers will have a consumer surplus, right? Because their value is higher than the price that they're paying.
Right.
And at every point over here on the supply curve, producers will have a surplus because they're selling it for more than the minimum price they're willing to sell it. Does that make sense?
More time. So as the demand curve goes up, you're saying the consumers have a surplus?
Yeah. So at every price, at every section up here on this line, then consumers will have a surplus, and in every section on this line, producers will have a surplus. So that's why these areas are respectively producer surplus and consumer surplus.
so if the demand curve becomes more inelastic, the consumer surplus increases. I think.
But this is a good question. If the demand was higher for the iPhone, right? Is what you're saying? So on the consumer side, basically like the first equation, if we're buying an iPhone at $600, how much we're willing to pay, if the demand goes higher, would it be worth more?
I'm sorry, so I'm just kind of confused with the consumer surplus. So let's say the demand for iPhones are really high.
Right.
And you're going in there dude, I'm going to KSL and snatch one for $600. But if the demand's higher, wouldn't they be selling them for a higher cost, which would not have a consumer surplus?
So that just depends, right? Because let's say that your maximum benefit you want to get out of an iPhone was $600, but the only phones that you could find were $700, $800. They were above your maximum benefit, then you would be represented by one of these points over here on this curve, where the transaction is actually not taking place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So then,
Okay.
if the transaction doesn't take place, there's no surplus at all, right? Because nobody's getting any value. Nothing happened.
I follow, yeah.
Okay, does that make sense? So then, how about we do an example? So if I were to say that this line right here is, this point right here is 2, this is, let's go with 8, and that this was 12, and that this quantity over here was 100. Who can calculate producer surplus for me? Try and calculate it.
Is it 300?
Why is that? How'd you do that?
I found the area of the producer surplus triangle, which is base times height divided by 2.
Right.
And your base, if you turn your head and look over at it, it's 8 minus 2, which is 6. So that's your base.
Right.
Your height would be that 100 quantity. And you multiply those
Did everybody catch that? You guys want us to go over that? Okay. So when you're looking at producer surplus, right? What you're trying to calculate is the area of this triangle. Same thing with consumer surplus, right? So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be using the values on the graph to calculate the areas of these triangles. Does that make sense? So if you're trying, and here we have the area of a triangle over here, right? So it's 1/2 the base times the height. So if you wanted to find the base, like you were saying, what you would do is you come over here, right? You can pick this as the base. So then, what is the length of from here to here of this base?
8 minus 2, which is 6.
Right. Does everybody get that? So now, what about the height? How do you find the height? Yeah, it's just 100, right? Because you can look here down at this axis, and you can see that this distance, as reflected down here, is 100. So your height is equal to 100. So then, if you want to calculate the area of that triangle, you just plug it into your formula. 1/2 base, 6, times height, 100, which gives you 300. And that would be your producer surplus for this one. I'm going to change this number up here to 15. I want you guys to calculate consumer surplus and then total surplus. Okay, so just try it. Go ahead and try it, and then we'll give you like a minute to calculate those two and see if you can do it. Okay?
What did you change? You said you changed something.
I changed this value up here, so that's 15 now. Video starts. Are you guys done? Or you need a couple more seconds? Done? Okay, cool. What did you guys get? Okay, so for consumer surplus, you said 350. Then what about total surplus? Okay, anybody lost on how they got total surplus? Everybody good? You just add consumer and producer, and then get you your total. Okay. Awesome. Okay. Now Tanner is going to talk about efficiency, and we're going to start getting into taxes and all that fun stuff.
Okay, everybody, you still need this?
Any questions on this? Are you guys okay? Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're starting with, I'll go nice and big. We start with this normal supply and demand, right? And our equilibrium, price and quantity. Okay, so in this situation, is the market efficient?
Yes.
Yes, because it's selling at the optimal price and quantity. This is also when total surplus is maximized. Everybody see why?
Because it's 0.
Because what?
It's 0.
What's 0?
There's
There's no loss.
Yeah.
Exactly. So now when we introduce a tax, we'll say a $3 tax. So we'll shift up. So that becomes supply curve plus $3, and same thing down here. So now we get a new supply curve. We'll call it S1. Okay, everybody follow so far? The tax, because we're assuming in this situation that the supplier has to pay a $3 tax. So that's shifting the supply curve up just $3. So now instead of here where, say, he would have sold for $6, now he's only going to sell for $9, right? So now what happens in this situation?
Does the market remain efficient?
No.
No.
What happens to the quantity that's sold?
Goes down.
It goes down, good. So we go to the new equilibrium and come down. We call that Q1. And this is the new price, P1. Where is that? So now, before we had this line, and we had producer surpluses all this area. Was all this area where it was below the price but above supply curve, right? But now what happens, because now the effective price that they're receiving is just this, same amount, minus the tax. So it comes over, we'll call that P after the tax, the realized. So that's the effective price that's actually getting to the producer, right? So now, what's the new producer surplus?
New producer surplus is that area minus that little tiny triangle. Can't really point to it from here. But
You're saying, so we had this whole triangle first, and we put some colors. So you're saying that triangle minus what?
minus that, where Q1, the dotted line goes up.
Minus this triangle?
Is that right?
Partially. You're right, that's important. But how is producer surplus calculated? It's below the price that you're effectively getting, but above the supply curve. Are they getting this equilibrium price? They're actually getting this price right here. So then this whole area is producer surplus.
Same with consumer.
Yeah, so now it happens with consumer.
Same thing, but like what?
Yeah, so it's now that this new price that they're paying, so we'll draw this line, that's below the demand curve. So it's this whole area is the consumer surplus. And now, since we have, that's kind of crooked, but now since we have this area here, what does this whole area represent? What does that rectangle represent? It's tax revenue to the government. And then what is this triangle? Dead weight loss. So someone explain to me why this is not efficiency in the market.
So from P1 to PT, that whole rectangle, or is it just the green rectangle?
Both.
That whole rectangle.
Because there's all those transactions that would happen in that little triangle aren't happening, so that's why it's not efficient.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's really good.
Sorry, which circle was dead weight loss? Or sorry, triangle was dead weight loss again.
This triangle right here that's formed from the old price and quantity.
So both tabs, not just the shaded one.
Yes.
So here,
I got that dirty.
that's okay. I can run that. So I'll draw something you guys can maybe put in your notes. That's just because now that you guys have the concept, just something you can put in your notes so you can just reference to it. So just with some quick labels, just in case, because it's good that you guys understand the concept now. But let's just draw this. So
And have you guys had to talk about it on the homeworks? Have you seen a tax that affects the demand side where the consumer has to pay the tax?
they have seen that.
Has that been on like the homeworks?
So red is deadweight loss. There's your producer surplus. Blue will be your consumer surplus. And then this black area is tax revenue. So if you guys want to throw something like this in your notes, that's just clearly labeled. It might be helpful for you to reference it every once in a while. But these two are exactly the same thing, right? And normally, if there's no tax imposed, it would just look like that, right? So those are just some visualizations that I think will be good for you guys to try and kind of hammer in there. What have I done here?
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So you have the original supply, and then it moves up to the S1. But how come it's still in green? That in between the
So-
S1.
So the
supply
colors.
curve doesn't actually shift, and this is that's just to illustrate the tax increase. That's just to give you that distance.
Yeah.
See what I'm kind of saying?
So they're still producing at the same.
Right. But then the transactions aren't happening at the same amount anymore. Because see, over here, you're selling equilibrium quantity, and over here, it's shifted significantly over here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the shift in the supply curve, when you're actually looking at taxes, you don't have to really think about the shift in the supply curve. Just think of this tax wedge, right?
Question, on the first one we did, where the deadweight loss is it supposed to be green and a different color, or is that whole area deadweight loss?
This
That's-
whole area is, that's
Okay.
just the marker I had in my hand at the time.
Okay.
Yeah. So that whole triangle is deadweight loss, right? Because those transactions are no longer happening, right? And then this area doesn't count towards surplus because it's tax revenue, so it's going to the government. So producers aren't getting it, consumers aren't getting it, the government gets that, so that's why it doesn't count towards surplus. This doesn't count towards surplus because it's non-existent, right? Those transactions don't happen anymore. Does that make decent sense?
And those transactions don't happen because the tax makes it a higher cost, so the
Right.
demand goes down.
Right.
Is that the case? Okay.
Right. So we're going to do a less graphical example here in a second, just like that. There was something I wanted to say before we moved on. Oh yeah. How do you guys determine the tax rate, the per unit tax rate from a graph like this? If you were to look at it, what on the graph would represent the per unit tax rate?
That's between 2 points.
Right. So the difference between these 2 points, right? So if this was 6 and this was 10, then that represents the tax rate. So it would be 4, right? So just the distance between those 2 points.
Maybe that's the tax rate.
Yeah, the per unit tax rate. Does that make sense, guys?
Mm-hmm.
So then if you want to calculate tax revenue, or if you have to calculate tax revenue on a test, you can take that per unit tax rate, so this right here, and multiply it by the quantity that's being sold, and that will give you the tax revenue. For that, you would just use formula of a rectangle, right? So you guys want to do an example of that, or are you okay?
What's an example?
An example? Okay. Do you mind if I erase this there? Okay. So let's say we have this market right here. This represents 1,000 units. And then we get a tax imposed of 5. Okay. So let's say that you guys are given this, all right? And the question wants to know what is the per unit tax rate and also the tax revenue. So go ahead and try and calculate that real quick. Seems pretty easy. Should be. You guys are pretty smart. Most of the mistakes people make in econ is they overcomplicate things.
And I hope I got it right.
It'd be embarrassing if you don't.
That's pretty easy. It's like, no,
I sure hope you did.
I just contract formula.
Okay. What'd you guys get for the first one? For the per unit tax rate, what is it? 5, right? How'd you do that? Right, you're just trying to find the length of this wedge. So you just go 7 minus 2 gives you 5. Right. Any questions on that? On how you find the per unit tax rate? Cool. And then what about tax revenue? How do you find that? Right. You're just calculating the area of this rectangle. So you just use, isn't it nice that we don't have this many formulas this time? No elasticity formulas? Pretty sweet, right? So yeah, you just use your area of a rectangle. So you go, the tax times the units sold, and that will generate a tax revenue. What'd you guys get? 3,750.
Wait, what you just do?
So he just did multiply the per unit tax rate times the quantity, which was $7.50, and that gives you the tax revenue.
So yeah, it's like he said, per unit tax rate times the quantity, or if you want to think of it in terms of the rectangle, the base times the height. So this times this. So 750 times 5. Calculate that area.
Now try and calculate the deadweight loss.
Can you guys do that?
Yeah.
Sweet. That's what I like to hear. What'd you guys get?
625.
625. How'd you do it?
Base is 5.
Base is 5.
Height's 250.
Height is 250, right? And then what's the formula?
These times of 500.
So then it's just 1/2 5 times 250. Or if that's confused, or if you need that extra step, go 1/2 5 times 1,000. Does that make sense? Any questions on this? Cool.
Where did that 5? So the 5 came from. So the base of it's 5, correct?
Right.
It's still the per unit tax rate, same way you got it. The 7 minus the 2.
Okay, and that 250 is the height. Okay, I see it.
So then, another question that you're likely to see on the test, right, is if you get a graph like this, and it says, all right, if a tax of $5 is to be imposed, what price will consumers pay, and what price will producers effectively receive? Who can answer those questions? Right off the bat. Okay, you guys got it real quick. Does everybody get why?
What was the question?
So you might, on the test, you may see a graph that looks something like this, and you might get a question that says, all right, after the tax is imposed, what price do consumers pay, and what price do sellers effectively receive? Does that make sense?
Is it,
So in this one, would the sellers be paying more of the tax than the consumers?
So I don't.
No, it's equal. It's half and half. Isn't it? Isn't that why there's two rectangles?
It looks equal because it's
No,
not like
it's
the
not.
scale, but yeah. So in this situation, the producer pays more of the tax.
So it just depends on the magnitude, right? So you can calculate those areas to find that. And then it also depends on elasticity, which we will go over
Is that because the
in
difference
just a minute.
5 to 2 is 3 and 75 is 2?
Yeah,
can
exactly.
you answer your original question?
Yeah,
Sorry, guys. Yeah.
No, people are actually, it's not your fault, it's like.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah. So think about it, right? If there's no taxes in the market, then the equilibrium price, then the consumer's going to be paying $5, right? And the producer takes $5. Government's not involved at all.
Yeah.
Okay? But if all of a sudden the government comes in, like they do in this case, and they say, all right, for every transaction, we're going to take $5 from that transaction. Then what happens is, if I pay $7 to the producer, the government then takes 5 of those dollars, and the producer only gets 2. So if the government wasn't involved, I'd be paying 5, but because the government is involved, now I'm paying 7. Let's say if I'm paying it to Tanner, Tanner only really gets 2 out of my $7 because the government took 5 of them. Does that make sense? So if it asks you, after the tax, what price are the consumers paying and what price are the sellers effectively receiving, it's asking, okay, after the government comes in and takes its portion, how much of each transaction is the seller getting and how much is the consumer paying for each transaction?
So, in this situation, if the tax was, let's say, $5, then the producers would only be getting $2.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
price.
So the easy way to do it graphically is just look at it, look at the tax wedge, and then find these two numbers. That's it. That's all you have to do.
Oh, gotcha.
Any questions on that? Does that make sense?
So how does who's paying more come in?
Who's paying more?
This platform, how does that
I'm going to table that for just a minute because before we get into that, but remind me if I don't come back to it, but I promise that we will. We'll be talking about elasticity and stuff. Sorry, did you have a question?
And do we have that paper going around still? We're writing names. Okay.
Great.
Are we supposed to write more than once?
No, just so we know. It means nothing. We just want to know.
So now we're going to do another example that is kind of along these same lines, but it's going to be more of a story problem, something else that you might run into. So let's say that Tanner and I start offering private tutoring that you guys would pay for. This isn't real. We can't do private tutoring.
Unless you want to pay us.
Yeah. I'll pause the video for a minute. If you want to pay us. But in all reality, we do it for our pay that we get every year if you guys really need it. But let's say that we were offering private tutoring, okay? And let's say you, okay? So what would be the maximum amount you'd be willing to spend for an hour of private tutoring for econ?
Depends how bad I needed it. And
So
like
you-
what time frame.
So you need it pretty bad. You procrastinated. It's the day before the final. Need some help.
Dude, I could spend a lot of money. Probably like $40.
$40.
Like,
Okay.
I'm really, like, we're on the edge right there. Like, we're like.
Gibbs on tutoring him.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say his willingness to pay is $40 for that hour of tutoring. That would be really nice. So he's willing to pay $40. Let's say that Tanner, the minimum amount that he's willing to accept for that hour of tutoring is $25. Let's say that they agree on a price of $30. Okay, so $30 is the price that they agree on. What is your consumer surplus and his producer surplus for that transaction? And the total surplus. You guys calculate that for me?
So his is 10, and his is 5.
Uh-huh. Right, so then what's the total surplus?
Yeah, the other.
Right, right, and at this price, will that transaction take place?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so let's say that the government comes in and they say, all right, for tutoring sessions, we're going to impose a tax, okay? That for every hour of tutoring, you have to pay the government $15. Tanner has to send $15 into the government. So now, can you guys tell me, will this transaction take place?
Actually, it would.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
It'll be even. There won't be any
It'll be even,
surplus, but the transaction will take.
Dead on. Really good, right? So because his minimum that he's willing to accept is $25, but now he has this additional $15, right? His minimum is going to go from 25 up to 40. Does that make sense? And since that is right here, where that is, that means that the marginal benefit and marginal cost equals each other. So it will happen, but there's no surplus. Does that make sense? So then what would happen if the government said, hey, we're making pretty good money off of screwing over econ tutors. Let's change this tax rate to 20. What's going to happen now?
Nobody wins.
Right, the transaction's not going to take place. Because the minimum that Tanner is going to be willing to accept will be $45, and the maximum he's willing to pay is $40. So he's going to end up going on Chegg or something instead, just saying, screw it. Yeah, just saying, screw it, it's not worth $45. And Tanner's going to say, well, I'm not taking any less than 45 because otherwise it's not worth my time. Cool? Does that make sense? Foreshadowing on that one. Lock that one in. Okay. Cool. All right, now we can talk a little bit about tax incidence. You want to read that one? Like the USSD and stuff? Which side? There's the sure. Does anybody else need any of this stuff? You good? Everybody cool? Yeah. At least just give me like a little. Sweet. Okay.
Okay, so who can tell me the definition of tax incidence?
Who pays the tax?
Sorry?
Is that who pays the tax?
Who pays the tax? Who pays most of the tax? Exactly. So let's say we have our supply and demand curves. In this situation, so then we get our tax wedge. We'll go from 10 to 15 and 8. It's not to scale, everybody can see. We'll call that 1,000 and this 1,250. Okay, so in this situation, who pays most of the tax?
Consumer.
Tell me why.
Because they paid $5 on tax. The demand is.
So there's a total of a $7 tax, right? 8 up to 15. And the consumer has to pay 5 of it, while the producer is only effectively having to pay $2 of it. So in this situation, what is the consumer's tax burden, and what's the producer's tax burden? $5,000 versus $2,000. So in this situation,
Before we move on, does everybody get how they did that? No? Okay. Let's explain that real quick.
So the producer, their tax burden was the difference between this, so that's $2, right? $2. And there's 1,000 units that were sold, so it's just 2 times 1,000. And then the same thing for the top. This distance is 5. So then you get 5 times 1,000. Okay. So then the total tax revenue would be 7,000, right? Okay. Anything else on tax systems?
Just talk about elasticity a little bit.
Okay, yeah. What was it called that you just did? Tax what?
Tax incidence or tax burden. So it just, all it is you're trying to determine pretty much who gets affected more by this tax, the producers or the consumers? Or who's paying the majority of it?
Okay, so I'm going to erase these lines. I'll draw a couple more. I'll try and draw this one scale, just make it easy. So now suppose that the demand curve is a lot more steep. What does this look like? Is this a more elastic or inelastic demand? Inelastic, right? So now we'll draw a new tax burden. We'll still call it $7. This is kind of the same situation. Everyone's kind of see why this is the same as what happened last time, so I just called it 15, 10, and 8. That's exactly what we had, just a little more to scale. So then it ended up that the producers paid less with the tax. So when demand is inelastic, what happens?
Consumers bear more burden.
Right, because a price change, the quantity demanded doesn't change very much, right?
So then if you want to draw, you can just leave that one in there, because I think it would be good for contrast. So then if supply is super inelastic and demand is relatively elastic, and you look at the same thing, wow. Pardon the drawing. But if you look at the same thing, what are you going to see? Who's paying the majority of this tax? Right. See, because what you're looking at is how big this triangle is, right? Or, sorry, this rectangle. So this part of the rectangle is a lot bigger than that one. And in this case, that part is a lot bigger than this one. So just remember that. The less elastic side of the market bears the majority of the tax burden.
Okay, I'll write it right here. So
Write it by the formulas.
Okay. Inelastic. Okay, so we just said it. So when demand is inelastic, who pays the most of the tax? Consumers. So write that here. When it's elastic, the opposite would be true, right? Then it's mostly on the producers. So now when supply is inelastic, who pays the most of the tax? Why? Because of the opposite of supply. Trying to explain why. Can anyone explain that? One way to do it, yeah. So when it's inelastic, when it's more vertical, any change in price doesn't really change the quantity, right? Everybody got that? Okay, so what does that mean? It means they can't change their price, otherwise people won't buy it. So they have to accept more of the tax burden in order to sell that unit. And then the same is for when it's an elastic supply. That's when the consumer pays it.
So I wrote a quote in the formula section. I know it's not a formula, but treat it like one and memorize it. Just remember, the less elastic side of the market bears the most tax burden, okay? Just drill that through your head. Try to remember it. If you need to, you can just draw these graphs. So draw a graph with a super elastic demand and a super inelastic supply, and then vice versa. And you should visually be able to see that. Does that make sense? Is anybody confused on that?
So if both of them are inelastic or if both of them are elastic, is there I know there's a homework question, kind of ranking them pretty much.
I think it just depends on the magnitude, right? Of how inelastic or how inelastic they are. So it's hard to compare them relative to one
Yeah.
another. So in cases where they're really similar, the safe way to go is just calculate the tax burden, right?
Okay.
Just calculate those rectangles and then compare them. But if visually you see one that's like, this was super inelastic and this is pretty elastic, then you should know right off the bat. Or if you get a question that's just conceptual and says, in a market with inelastic demand, who would bear the most of the tax burden? Consumers, right? Does that make sense? Is everybody okay? Do you have a question?
Oh, no, sorry, I'm good.
You're okay. Okay. Everybody good on that? No heartburn?
Can I just ask a question? What was the concept before this that we covered? What was it called?
Concept before this was
Tax. No, so this is the tax. It's
Before
like
was like triangles up on the left, like those graphs. That's called.
yeah. So this is also tax incidence, but it's a couple different things, right? This is producer, consumer surplus, efficiency, tax revenues, deadweight loss. There's a lot of stuff in there,
So
but
it's not one cement. I mean, I followed it. I grasped
Good.
it. I just it's not like one thing. It's like this is tax.
Yeah.
We're tax.
yeah, it's a few different things. But yeah, this is particularly tax incidence. So it's which tax incidence has reference to which side of the market is bearing the most of the tax. This is kind of just showing you what happens to a market when a tax is imposed, and what happens to surplus. Total surplus, etc. Question?
So like, yeah, so you know how in class
Sorry, guys, I can't hear her very well. What's
so
up?
in class you did the tax rate and used this figure and put it on the graph.
Uh-huh.
Is that what we do in the test as well?
Yeah, you can do that. Like you can just pretty much do this, right?
I think she means when she can.
Oh, with the curve.
Yeah, just when she like.
Like, can you give an
Then
example?
compared it to that, he did the same tax burden just to show that the tax incidence was then different.
That
I
was
think
more.
that's what he did.
That was more.
He was trying to calculate deadweight loss.
Oh, you're trying to calculate that with loss.
See
What's
what
he talking
to
about?
see where the deadweight loss is greater. He was using the same tax.
Oh yeah, so then he just had another supply curve or like another set, and he did the same thing to then compare it.
He's seeing where the deadweight
Doing
loss
it
is
to make
greater.
sure you didn't see
Okay,
the
didn't-
numbers
okay.
or can you do an example of that?
You need some space.
We can. Is it alright if we erase these guys? You okay?
See.
Okay, so right, a little smaller. So you're saying you want like this, get that same distance?
So when he does that, he's looking for the deadweight loss in both of the graphs?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Okay.
Just yeah. So this was just so he could show like that the triangles are different, that the sizes of the triangle are different on each side,
Okay.
versus when.
And let,
I mean,
was he talking about maybe? Sorry, guys. This is just a Tanner, so don't. Like, was he maybe talking about like efficiency loss where both are elastic versus inelastic? Like doing the same wedge. There and there.
Yeah. Just like
Is that
oh,
what he's
yeah,
talking
that's
about?
yeah.
I think that's
Okay, yeah, okay, that makes
make
sense.
sure, like, with the same tax
So what's the
rate.
wedge?
The same tax rate.
The wedge?
Oh, okay.
That's kind of referred to as the size of the
Okay,
tax.
I see what you got.
That size of that vertical line I drew, and the wedge would be. Yeah, so I guess that's the wedge, and then you calculate the deadweight loss. It's that chunk.
Yeah. So yeah, the one that was like this is going to have a bigger deadweight loss. Isn't it?
What was that?
Yeah.
Could you
I'm
repeat
just
it?
using my hands, my arms like this.
Everybody can hear. Everybody needs to hear it. Go ahead.
Well, my question was like, why did it have a greater deadweight loss? Was it just because the greater area within the triangle? And just said, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. Do you guys want us to go through that a little bit more in detail? Yeah. No.
Okay, moving on to externalities next.
So everyone's good with that then? Okay. All right,
Everybody still need this?
Right now, are we focusing on chapter 4, 20, or is it a mixture of both?
This is everything.
That was chapter 4, and now we're going to public goods and externalities. I think that's 20, right?
No, so public goods and externalities is 4, taxes was 20.
Okay.
So
we just did 20 now.
the two chapters are super interconnected. Like the concepts carry over. Like this producer consumer surplus is all there. Deadweight loss is there. So we kind of are just plowing through what we found as we were going through the materials that we have. You know, trying to get the concepts that will be most applicable to the tests. So, yeah. All right, who can?
Real quick question: could we possibly get a list of topics that we should study for the test, like in our own free time?
Sure.
You don't have to do it like necessarily now. Yeah, last time you guys wrote that list, super helpful.
Sure. Yeah, I've got it in my notebook. I was just too lazy to write on the board this time, so I will undertake that at some point when Tanner is teaching you guys stuff.
Confusing everybody.
Okay. So, who can define an externality for me? What is an externality?
It's like an effect on people that didn't have to do a transaction. So.
Right.
Yeah, it's like the third party that's affected.
Right. That's not part of the transaction.
Where there's no exchange of money. Nobody is giving him anything. He's not paying anything.
Right. It's spillover effect from a transaction, right? And there are two types of externalities. What are they?
Positive and negative.
Positive and negative. Really good. Okay, so tell me, what does a negative externality look like?
You're on the right side.
So I guess we'll move back a little bit. When we're talking about externalities, right, we're talking that either the market is producing too much of something and it's affecting things negatively. So that's like the pollution example, right? The market is producing too much paper and it's polluting this river. People are getting sick. So even though the market reflects this for our supply and demand, the real amount that we would want to be supplied is lower, right? So this would be called the social cost. So this is a negative externality, right?
So, how do you define externality?
It's kind of a third-party benefit or cost to a transaction. So you weren't involved in it, but you're reaping the benefit or suffering the
Does that make sense, that graph? Do you guys understand why that graph is the way it is?
So is that saying so for example, we're making too much paper, and so it's decreasing supply, or
So it's actually not that it's decreasing supply, it's that we would actually, as society, we want supply to decrease, right? Because if supply were to decrease by that magnitude, then we would not be having these spillover effects and we'd be reaching that optimum quantity where we're still getting paper, but we're not getting as much pollution. So it's that balance that would be the optimal quantity for society.
So if you could quantify how much it was worth to me for that plant to stop producing, that would be the difference.
Yeah, if you can quantify it for you and then all of us as well, and then balance it with that market system. I'll get to you in just one second. Yeah.
So if you look at the price, where the equilibrium of the social cost is, the price is a lot higher because that's the price, the extra price that people have to pay.
Right.
So then a positive externality, they would be paying less because it's actually benefiting them that that person's producing.
Yeah, you're right. So we'll get to that in just one second. And so notice that, like he said, right, the price is higher than our equilibrium. So price is higher. And the quantity is lower.
Question.
So does that only count if like a third party, like the government, has come in and taken steps to correct the externalities?
So supply will only actually shift if the government comes in and corrects it, right?
Otherwise, it's stay at the equilibrium.
Yeah, because right now, this right here is just kind of like a desired curve, right?
Hypothetical.
Yeah, it's a hypothetical curve. So it's like, that's where we want supply to go, but if supply is actually to move there, we have to do something to make it move there.
So
Does that
without
make
the
sense?
shift, is it inefficient, or does that even play a role?
Yeah, it is. Efficient. We'll get to that in just one second. But first, he's had a question for like 20 minutes.
It kind of got answered, but so social cost is like basically imposed by society. It's not what the government puts on, but it's like, what? It's
So yeah.
hypothetical.
Yeah, it's the desire curve, or you can think of it as that if supply were here, it would be the best for everyone. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But supply won't actually go there unless the government or somebody else intervenes and changes it.
On that seminary parking lot.
The guy was just texting in the middle of the road. I would have honked at him too. Okay, other questions? So, deadweight loss. You want to cover that?
Sure. Okay, so looking at this, where's the deadweight loss? You can tell me. Is it this triangle you're saying?
No.
Someone argued.
Yeah, it's that triangle because like if you correct the externality, it's like the same. Like oftentimes the way externalities are corrected is through taxes and other things. So that's still the number of transactions that will happen if the externality is corrected.
I like your thought. You're a little off, just a little bit, but we'll chat. So,
So it's actually this triangle. No, take that one off the test. It's this one? Yeah, it is this one. Okay. The other one, the other one is for positive externality. This one. So this area represents the difference between the number of transactions that actually happened and the number of transactions that we wanted to have happen, right? So more happened than we wanted to have happen.
Is that the definition for deadweight loss?
Yes, that's what this triangle is.
deadweight loss is just an inefficiency in the market. So in terms of taxes, right, it's this right here. And the reason why that's happening is because of the tax. But in this case, the reason why it's happening is because we're overproducing something and it's causing damage. So these transactions, like Tanner was saying, that are represented by this triangle, are causing damage and are actually not desirable to society. Does that make sense? So they're both deadweight losses, but they're deadweight losses for different reasons. So does that answer your question? Remember what you were talking about? Because in the case of taxes, taxes are causing deadweight losses because the equilibrium is efficient, right?
So we're not talking about it in terms of a firm. We're talking about it in terms of like the general population.
It can be both. It can be both. But the point I'm trying to get across here is, in this example, right, deadweight loss was caused by a tax because the market was producing the exact quantity that society would want, right? The market was efficient. It was doing exactly what we wanted to do. But then when we imposed this tax, we moved it away from what we were wanting it to do, and so it created this deadweight loss. Over here, the market is not doing what we want it to do, right? It's not producing at the level we want it to produce. We want it to be producing here, and because of that, that area is a deadweight loss because we're actually producing too much.
So that's why you have to shift it.
Right, that's why we would want it to shift.
You want the government to step in and shift it to fix that.
Exactly. Does that make more sense? So it's pretty much whenever a market is inefficient or whenever the market is not producing the quantity that is optimal for society, there's a deadweight loss. Okay? So whenever the market is not producing the optimal quantity for society, there's a deadweight loss. So taxes can cause that because they're moving us away from this optimal quantity here. Over here, our optimal quantity is not the equilibrium point because at the equilibrium point we're producing too much and it's causing damage. So our optimum quantity is actually here, right? And because it's not where it's supposed to be, it's over here, we're producing too much, this is a deadweight loss. That's the loss that society is occurring because of the inefficiency of the market.
So, were you saying that a negative externality is when the supply curve shifts, and that's where you get the dead weight loss there? And then positive externality is the second graph that you're drawing right now. It would be the demand that's shifting.
Right. So a negative externality means that the market is producing too much, so supply is too big, right? There's too much supply. And we want that to shift back, okay? A positive externality means that demand, there's not enough demand for something. So like vaccines, right? Vaccines have a positive externality because they actually help other people besides the people who are just being vaccinated, right? So you actually want more, society would want more vaccines than it would actually demand. So then that produces an inefficiency as well. So, quick thing to drill into your heads. The vast majority of the time, if we're talking negative externality, you're going to see supply. If you're talking positive externality, you're going to see demand.
Okay, so then where's dead weight loss on a positive externality?
Triangle.
Right
From where?
From
right here?
there down.
And there down?
No, it would be not a regular.
This is the one that I was thinking there. It's actually this up, and it's this triangle.
So it always just sticks to the left.
Yeah, because, and the way you, in order for a transaction to take place, it has to be above the supply and below the demand, right? So if you were out here, that would be below the supply and above the demand. So that transaction would take place. Right? And then over here, same thing. I mean, I did that same mistake. But now it's above supply, below demand. That's what the dead weight loss region is.
So that one is.
So what would you call that triangle? Dead weight loss.
And this one? What's that?
Yeah, and this.
It's dead weight loss.
Yeah.
And why is it
As-
like the other one's inefficient? Overproduction. This is lack of. Or
Yeah, this represents the transactions. This is how many we wanted to have happen. This is how many actually happened. So we want more of it to happen. We want more people to go to school, so the government will give you some money to go to school. Right? That's them trying to correct this positive externality.
So this positive.
Does that make sense? So in this case, not enough is demanded. So there needs to be, we want there to be more demand for it. We need more of that product because the market naturally on its own is not producing enough or allocating enough. That makes sense?
So is that like social, sorry, this is completely off, it's just my thought. So the blue is social benefit?
Yes.
Right. Social cost is negative. Social benefit is positive. So if you're trying to remember the difference between negative and positive externalities, once again, something that I think is, if it's having a negative spillover effect, so it means like bad things happen when too much is produced, it's negative. Oh, and when the spillover effect, right, those extra effects, the externalities are good things, that we want more of it, it's positive. Okay. Another way you could think of it is like when it affects demand, it's positive. Yeah, for it.
Okay, so how do you correct a positive externality? Subsidies.
Perfect. Very good.
What does that do to the graph?
it shifts the demand curve.
Shifts it to where it actually does become a social benefit, right? That's if it's a subsidy on the consumer. Yeah.
So to correct positive externalities, it's a subsidy to the consumer, right? Producer.
So that
The agency got there. It's just a subsidy. So to correct a positive externality, it'll be a subsidy, and then to correct a negative externality, what would it be?
Taxes.
Boom, taxes. Very good.
What did you just say?
An example of subsidy would be like grants. or
Yeah,
school.
federal student aid,
Exactly.
stuff like that.
That's exactly what
What did you
like
just
grants
say?
are. Like Pell
He said
grants.
something, then he said boom. What did he say?
You said
Federal
He said something, then he said boom.
Those are subsidies that encourage us to go.
So a tax cures a negative subsidy, or a
So with
tax cures a
positive
negative externality,
externality,
and a subsidy
does
cures
that
a
mean that
positive
Positive.
price
Yeah.
will decrease and
Got
volume
that.
will increase? Is it just flop or?
With a positive externality?
Yeah.
So you can look at it here, right? So if this was to shift, what would happen to price and to quantity?
They both increase.
They both increase, right? And then over here, right, price would increase and quantity would decrease. That makes sense? Are you guys okay with that? It's not giving you too much heartburn. If you do have questions, please tell us, because you're probably not the only one who's confused.
So, question on the negative externality: why are you paying more? Why is the price higher?
Why is the price higher?
Yeah.
So it's the same thing as so if we were to actually correct this externality, right, we'd do it by imposing a tax. Right?
So it's like cigarettes, they haven't really had tax. Would that be an example of that?
That's exactly what that is.
Yeah. Okay.
That's exactly what that is. That's a perfect example. That's like a textbook example of a negative externality
So that,
and a tax to correct it. Yeah.
so again, that's only if they decide to actually correct the externality. If somebody's just complaining about it, then about like the noise level of a factory, but like nothing's actually been, no steps have been taken, then it will still remain at the
Equilibrium.
at the normal equilibrium.
Yep, exactly. Got it. Got it. Any other questions before we move on? You guys are okay? Okay. Thanks for nodding. I'm glad you guys are getting to the habit of that. It makes me feel a little bit more like reassured. Because when you just stare at me, I'm like, crap. Do they even understand? I feel like I'm doing a bad job. What?
How long is this?
90 minutes. So we should be done here in the next.
So
I think we'll run out of material here sooner.
What's next?
But
What's next?
What?
What's next?
Okay.
Then we're going on
A couple of things to cover. You guys know what a command and control system is. Okay, can somebody explain that to me? It's
Where the government controls means production.
yeah, sort of. Yeah, that's when you're talking about a command economy, then yes. But a command and control system can also be implemented to fix externalities. So if the government said, instead of doing a tax, if they just came in and they told them, hey, you can't produce more than X amount of units of paper, then that would be a command and control solution.
If you do it, you go to jail. So like
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Yeah, if you produce over this amount, or if you pollute X amount, we're going to shut down your factory. So, that's another solution to an externality. And then we're going to talk briefly about Coe's theorem. Who remembers Coe's theorem?
Real quick, so you say command systems like when the government said you produce this much or
Yeah.
include this or that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
So
are
all you
permits
guys,
an example of that?
probably need to know what.
Are permits like an example of like the command and control system?
Mm,
Like you'd have to have a permit to get down a tree.
not necessarily, but if the government were to say, hey, X company, you can only cut down 8,000 trees per year, then that would be what that was. Does that make sense? So it's like putting a limit on how much a supplier can produce. So all you guys need to know is you need to remember what that is, right? So if you see something that says, it's like a like you just need to know the definition of it. Okay?
It was command and control theory.
Yeah, command and control system.
And the definition was just fixed externalities.
Yeah, so it's if the government comes in and establishes quotas or puts limits on a company, then that to fix an externality. Okay, and then we're going to touch really quickly on Coe's theorem. Do you guys remember what Coe's theorem is? Okay. That's what we're here for. Okay, so Coe's theorem.
Isn't it like finding a mutual beneficial thing between two parties, like listening to music too loud and then having to say that person?
Right. Okay, all you need to know about Coe's theorem is
How to spell it?
COASE.
yeah. I know I spelled theorem right. Probably didn't. All you need to know about it is that a solution to an externality can be reached. Wow, my handwriting is atrocious right now. I usually write in all caps, but I had a midterm today where I had to write all over the place.
I bet they wish my handwriting was that good.
You reached by two parties bargaining as long as transaction costs are not too high, as long as transaction costs are low. Okay. So,
Is this that example we talked about in class with snoring and stuff like that?
snoring, music, that's all Coase theorem.
Okay.
So the key word I want you guys to remember, that this is going to be your trigger word for Coase theorem, transaction costs are low, okay? That's your buzzword, right? You hear that, you know what you're talking about. Okay, so just remember, Coase theorem will work if transaction costs are low. Cool?
So does
And
that mean
what
like
that-
relatively low, or is it like actually just like small amounts?
Yeah, I just mean relative low, you know, like relative to the transaction. So, you know, if you're talking about something between two companies, then, you know, and they are reaching an agreement without, like, having to pay a ton of legal fees, then it's relatively low, even though their transaction costs might be higher than, like, two roommates.
So in the homework, I saw a question that was like, there's a, I can't remember what it was, but there was like bee farmers and then like florists or something, and it said that they can make an agreement to like help each other out. Would it be, yes, they can, as long as the transaction costs are low? Is that kind of the same thing we're talking about?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So that would be a really good, like, example of something you might see on an exam, is it would say, Coase theorem says that Margie and Angie might be able to reach an agreement about their, like, roommate situation if, and then one of the answers might be if transaction costs are low. That would be the right ones.
And it wouldn't necessarily be like a set number, but it'd be more like if marginal benefit was high for both of them. Like,
For that one, you're completely right,
Yeah.
but don't overcomplicate it, because it's pretty simple.
Literally say.
Just remember, transaction costs are low.
What if transaction costs are high?
Then it won't work.
Then you'd have to have a tax or a subsidy to fix it.
Yeah, the government will have to. Okay, next one. Let's talk about public goods for just a second.
What's the two requirements for it to be a public good?
No rivalry.
Excludability
Excludability. I was like, exclusivity.
and no, or no excludability and no rival. Someone explain to me what excludability means.
You can privatize it.
You can
If
put a
someone
toll booth
buy
on the
it,
highway.
someone
You
else
can,
Exclude somebody from benefiting.
yeah, you can bar someone from enjoying the public good. So what's rivalry now?
That's if I consume it, then you can't.
If I drank that gallon of milk, you can't. So it's and same thing, like he gave the example of a beach in Brazil where everybody wants that one spot. It's not a public good because only the people who got there first get to actually use it.
So those are just some very concise definitions. So rivalry, only one person can consume. Excludability, you can keep people out, right? You can keep people from using the product or the service. So, and then non-rivalry, non-excludability, they're the same things, but just opposite. So, for example, something that is rivalrous and excludable, right? Let's talk about food. So if you go to Chick-fil-A right now, can Chick-fil-A stop you from just walking in and stealing a sandwich? Yeah, so it's, that good is excludable, right? And if I eat a sandwich, can you eat that exact same sandwich?
No.
No, you freaking hope not, right? So that is a private good. So private goods are rivalrous and excludable, okay? Now let's talk about the police force, okay? So if, let's say we're paying for one unit of a police force, so one policeman, okay? One Orem police officer. So if that police officer protects me just by being around, is he only going to protect me? No, right? He's protecting the whole neighborhood. So it's not just one person that's using his service. So let's say that somebody said, I don't want to pay for the police force. Can you stop people from benefiting from the police force?
No.
No, right? He's not going to not stop that guy from being murdered, hopefully. So then that I could stop you from being murdered, but it's going to cost you. So in that case, the service of a policeman, right, is a public good because it's non-rivalrous and non-excludable.
So, but what if he's busy helping somebody else, and there's 2 people getting murdered at the same time, there's only one of them. So I mean, is that
So you're coming up with an argument that it's a quasi public good.
Yep.
I mean it's.
So I guess you could argue that most things fall.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there.
Exactly. Most things do fall under quasi-public goods. I mean, you can make an argument that things are quasi-public good. Even street lights, right? We talked about that one, where it's okay, well, we can't stop people from enjoying street lights, right? But I mean, maybe we could, right? If or you could say that, oh, maybe it is rivalrous because if I'm standing in that particular part of the street light, then somebody else can't stand exactly where I am and enjoy that part of the light. Right. So just don't overcomplicate. Right. So that's all you guys need to know.
Do we need to know the quasi thing?
Yeah, so quasi, I don't think that's coming up in the test, but all you need to know is that if it has attributes of both public and private goods, then it's a quasi-public good. That's all you really need to know. Yeah.
So,
QUA.
Yeah.
So this is for a private good, right? The
Yeah.
rivalry and excludability. So
Right.
public goods, the non
Yeah. So if it's, so this would be private, and then public would just be because I'm too lazy to write out definitions again, so. But I think you guys get the idea. Okay. Any more questions on that? Okay, and then if you're talking about free riding, right, we're talking about something that is not excludable. So there's the free rider problem, right? Where, say, for example, some super successful businessman from China, came to speak here at UBU, and they didn't charge to get into the event, but so let's say there was a poll, okay, they got sent out to say, all right, we're going to bring this speaker in. How much is that worth to all of you students? And everyone's like, oh, that's worth $15 to me. So then they put on the event, and then afterwards they go around, they ask for donations, and they only get $10. What happened there? Yeah, the vast majority, because it's non-excludable and because we didn't charge people to get in, everybody just free rode. Even though it was worth a certain amount to them, they didn't pay because they just free rode. So just remember that about free riding, what it is. About there.
How do you calculate the equilibrium price and quantity of a public good?
Let's do an example of that. We'll do that, and then we'll do a little bit about taxes, and then we'll be done. Okay. Do you want to do something like that one that we did earlier? Or is that a little too much?
You mean with Andre after class, or do you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, if you have that to pull up, because I want to try and come up with numbers that aren't working.
Yeah.
So you can start doing that.
Can't do that one.
So to start, everybody remember how to calculate the equilibrium price and quantity for the market with private goods?
Private is the demand was low.
Horizontally, right?
Yep.
Oh, yes.
Boom, boom. So then you pick a price, and then you add up however many each person wanted at that price, right?
That's private goods.
That's a private good.
What's it like called, what's that?
Horizontal summation.
Whoa.
Or aggregate demand.
What do we got?
Calculate the aggregate demand of a private good.
Aggregate demand, private good.
So now for a public good, you do vertical summation, right? So you pick the quantity, we'll draw that line, and then you add up the prices that each person was willing to pay, right? Everybody kind of see?
Yeah, so for the aggregate demand, the private good, you're just looking at.
For private goods, horizontally, you pick a price, then you add up the quantities that are wanted at that price. For a public good, you fix the quantity, and then you add the prices that each person was willing to pay.
Oh,
So that's like the example we did in class today.
Exactly like you.
Private. That was for a private good.
That was, I think that was a public good. But are we talking about the?
Public good.
That was a public.
Yeah, that was a public good.
Okay.
So, because what happened there, right, is we were looking at, all right, at 6 units, right, what is the total price that these people are willing to pay?
Mm-hmm.
And because it's a public good, they can all consume those same units. You add all of that together. Does that make sense?
So you'd say something like if they were doing a poll on this, they'd probably say something like, how much would you pay for 10 miles of road?
Exactly.
How much would you pay for military defense?
How much would you pay for military defense?
Just asking, like, what would that be worth to you, right? Like, what are those 10 extra miles of road in this area worth to you? And then if you were to poll that whole area, like everybody who lived in that city, and then add up what everybody said, that would be your price, or your value.
And so then for like a private good, you'd ask like the reverse of it. You'd say like, for
how many cheeseburgers are you willing to buy? $5.
That makes sense?
So on the private good, you're doing quantity at that price,
Right.
and then the other way you're doing
Price
at
and
the quantity.
Yeah, exactly. Good job. You guys picked that up quick. Okay, one last thing. And then, actually, one or two last things. We'll try and hurry. This is really quick. It's another just definition we want you guys to know, because it'll be useful. Talking about the different kinds of taxes, okay? So, let's talk about progressive. Regressive. And proportional. Okay. Who can give me a quick definition of these three?
The more you make, the more you pay.
Right? Progressive.
The less you make, the more you pay with progressive.
More income. Pay more. And then, what was this one?
The less you make, the more you pay.
Less income. Pay more. Yep.
Everyone pays the same.
Pretty much. Yep. So this would be like a flat tax.
Yeah, fixed rate.
Fixed rate. So everyone pays 10% of what they earn.
Is it not necessarily like pay more, but just like a higher percentage?
Yeah, higher percentage. Yeah. Pay, I guess, yeah, that's probably a better way to put it. Thanks for catching that.
Because I mean, the rich people are still technically paying a lot more than like.
Yeah. That was more I'm trying to move along and I was not ready, but that's,
He was just testing
that's
you.
That's definitely a better definition. Okay. You guys okay on that? Okay. So to leave you guys, this is gonna be our last thing today. It should take up the last 5 minutes. We're gonna do a quick challenge problem with something that we did at the beginning. Okay? So we're gonna rewind a little bit. This will be really helpful, I think. So are you guys okay on this? Are you still writing, some of you?
Just a second.
Okay. I'll just draw it down here then. Okay. So, I want you guys to tell me on this one, all right? So, go. This is 200. This is 175. Okay. So on this one, I want you to tell me if this tax right here is imposed by how much will consumer surplus decrease? Okay. You guys get it? So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to calculate at the initial consumer surplus and then calculate the consumer surplus after the tax to figure out the difference.
They
right?
need a top price too.
Oh crap! Sorry guys. That would be helpful, wouldn't it? Oh, 14.
And you're asking what is the
Okay. After the tax is imposed, how much will consumer surplus decrease? You guys need a couple more minutes, or are you good? You're good? All right, who can answer it for me? And walk me through it.
Is the difference 175? Is it decrease by 175?
I got
I got 350.
Yeah, it should be 350.
So first you calculate it's so long.
I think you probably just divided something in half that you were supposed to.
basically what I did, if this is correct,
okay.
I took the original triangle at the equilibrium point.
Right, which would be
at the 200 quantity.
This one, right?
Yeah, so that big triangle up there, I took that entire area and then I subtracted the area of the smaller triangle up on top.
Okay. Why did you do that?
Because if you take away that smaller triangle from the bigger triangle, you find out all that space right there of what you lost.
Yeah, good job. So this green triangle here, right? That was our original consumer surplus, right? And then after the tax was imposed, we are going to lose all of this, right? That's all gone because this goes to the government. That just doesn't happen anymore. So then this is our new consumer surplus. In order to find the difference, we subtract that red triangle from the whole thing, and then that's how much we've lost, which is 350.
So if you just do the red circle, red triangle anyway, you get 350?
Yeah, and that's just a coincidence that
That's
the
just
numbers are the same.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's just because I made up numbers when I made up this example. So, but does that make sense to you guys? Would you feel comfortable kind of doing different variations of problems like that? Okay. Cool. Well, that's all we've got for you. Thanks for coming. Hope it was helpful. If you guys haven't already taken it already, we have the survey up talking about suggestions. So you can drop us a line, tell us what we can do better. Thanks. Good luck.
Question, can I get a picture of your topics? Or did you just have an answer?
Yeah, sure.
Is it a list or was it like?
This is this page.
I think you're gonna-
If you pick stuff up and then I can.
For some reason I thought, I don't know why we mind it.
I'm trying to sell your intellectual property.
Okay, you're fine.